So this session, Remember Us. This is a conversation with best-selling author Robert Edsel about his latest work, Remember Us, American Sacrifice, Dutch Freedom, and a Forever Promise Forged in World War II. Now, interviewing Robert is Colonel retired Pete Crean. Pete's our Vice President of Education and Access here at the National World War II Museum. He's responsible for content, so let's give Pete a round of applause. Before coming here in 2017, Pete was the director of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center up at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania, an Army officer with 3 decades of experience and a logistician, so I was quite happy to hear the comments about logisticians today. Has a Master of Science degree in Logistics Management, go figure, but also a Master of Strategic Studies from the U.S. Army War College. And with that, we're going to let Pete launch into the conversation with Robert Edsel. Pete, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. So for the last day and a half, we have been talking about a lot of fascinating stories, and we've learned about a lot of people and a lot of adventurous stories, and some of them humorous, some of them not so humorous, and some of them ending in tragedy. But they all ended with an announcement. The ones that died ended with a death, and that was it. That was the end of the story. And so today's topic, or this topic, is not. There will be no humor. There's nothing humorous about this. But this also goes into the what happens next, a piece of the study of military history and a huge part of World War II that really doesn't get looked at and is absolutely fascinating. And although I know I don't really need to introduce him because most of the people in this room know him very well, but I'm going to do that anyway. We have former Board of Trustees member, New York Times best-selling author of 5 books, Robert Edsel, that include, of course, everyone knows of Monuments Men, Saving Italy, Rescuing Da Vinci, The Greatest Treasure Hunt in History, and now Remember Us. You know of the film Monuments Men that came out in 2014. He was also the co-producer of the documentary film The Rape of Europa in 2007. And founder and leader of the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, and also has another new project that we can talk about at the end, the Forever Promise Project. So let's welcome to Robert Edsel. So let's give one big number here. We'll start with that. There were 414,920 Americans that died in World War II. Unlike many other countries, most of ours were service members. Like I said before, we learned individual stories. This is talking about the stories of people that were involved that either fell in Europe, served in Europe, or helped preserve the legacy of those who did. So let's just start off with talking about Remember Us and how it got started. So, Robert, you brought to life the major untold story of World War II and Monuments Men. And now you've done it again with Remember Us. What is Remember Us about?
Remember Us follows the lives of 12 American men, combat soldiers, paratroopers, air crews, a chaplain, and a gravedigger. And their lives converge in and around the Limburg province area of the Netherlands in the very south, a dog-leg portion of the country that is just a few miles away from Belgium to the west, Germany to the east, and just north of France. And it's there that the Ninth Army builds the cemetery, the Ninth Army Cemetery, in the little town of Margraten, which is just 10 miles from the German border in the major city of Aachen. And there, General Eisenhower had assured the troops no one would be buried on enemy soil. So the intent was to round trip casualties back and bury them at the cemetery there, which was done up until the very last part of the war. But the story doesn't end there. At that stage of the end of the war, you're about 2/3 the way through the book, just 2/3, because there I get a chance to tell a story that's inspiring about gratitude, remembrance, and grace. Set against the backdrop of the most destructive war in history is this moment that the Dutch people asked themselves this question even during the war: how do you thank your liberator when they're no longer alive to thank? And they came up with and created a grave adoption program and made a promise 81 years ago that they've continued to honor to this day. And that is the story I tell in Remember Us.
So, and you know, I served in Germany for 5 years in the 90s and was at the 50th anniversary of the Market Garden operation and was there when they reopened the cemetery to bury Lieutenant Utrecht. And was struck by how many school children were there as part of this program. So it was obviously lasting at that time. How did the program come around and you know, what makes it lasting even to this day?
Well, part of the reason I think we don't know this story, I mean, we see all these World War II movies and soldiers are killed and then it's cut to the next scene. And we don't ever talk about what actually happens to a soldier when they're killed. Think about it. Okay, I get it. You said earlier we won't have a moment of humor. I'll give you one. When I was pitching this to the 68 out of 69 publishers that rejected the book, they said, man, this sounds depressing. And I said, how so? And they said, well, everybody dies. And I said, well, first of all, I haven't written it yet, so you don't know who lives or dies because I haven't decided myself. I haven't picked all the characters. And then I thought, you know what? You must have been that only person that went to go see the movie Titanic and thought everybody was going to get off alive.
I stand corrected.
So, of course, yes, we're talking about an incredibly serious topic. We're talking about our freedom, and I'll get to the point of underscoring that in a few minutes. But the reason it hasn't been told is it is that part of the story is depressing. I mean, it's bad enough we know our soldiers died, but then to have to witness what actually does happen, for them either to have made it back to the United States or be buried overseas is a difficult, oftentimes gruesome, and in the process of burials, sometimes very dangerous task. But it's the car wreck that we don't want to look at that we do because it hasn't been told. And if that had been the end of the story, it wouldn't have attracted me. But the Dutch were neutral during World War I, and they didn't suffer the horrible trench warfare and losses that their neighbors did. And they declared neutrality in World War II, and Hitler said he would observe it, and he did until he didn't. The Dutch had known freedom for 100 years when they lost it in May 1940. One of the ladies, the key figure in the book, a Dutch woman, mom of 12, she had 7 children before the war, 3 during the war, and 2 after. 37 years old. Emily Michels van Kestnik, we'll refer to her as Emily, had these diaries that she kept from the time her children were born until she died in 1970. And she was recording on May 7th, 8th, 9th, having gone to wedding receptions, having received invitations to christenings on May 12th, May 13, 1940, how much they were looking forward to it. And they were stunned on May 10th to hear German planes overhead, find out there'd been paratroopers dropped at Fort Ebenamel, and so on. And they weren't prepared for it. They didn't have a resistance network. They didn't have a black market. And they were occupied in that part of the Netherlands for 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days. And they didn't like losing their freedom, the freedom that they had taken for granted. And when Americans showed up in September 44, they were overjoyed, immensely grateful. You know, I use a quote in the book from a fellow who was the son of a Jewish doctor who died here recently, but he lived during these years. And I used it because it was so poignant. It was something he wrote in a small pamphlet he wrote for his family, but they allowed me to use it. And he said, you know, today it all seems so easy to understand. We know World War II started in 1939 formally. We know it ended in 1945. We know America got into this war and that the good guys prevailed. But in 1940, when we were occupied, that was the new normal. America was saying, we don't want to get involved in this stuff, and they didn't until they were forced into it. And even then, it didn't look like to us that they might be successful in getting over here. So it's a point well taken. And so it seems easy, like the Dutch were trying to just figure out what date we're going to arrive. The Dutch were wondering, will we ever arrive? Will anybody ever come and free us from the bondage that we're in? And they did. And when they did, they started trying to find ways to connect with these boys. Now, we're an agrarian society. Our guys are coming from farms, and they're seeing countryside that looks like where they came from. These beautiful fertile fields, everything grows, people working with their hands, you know, the different language, but they got it. And they communicated. The Dutch didn't have any food. American Army had food. They cooked it for them. The Dutch didn't have any detergent. American Army's got detergent. They washed their clothes. They let them stay in their barns, in their homes. They got to know them. And this 9th Army, our largest army at the end of World War II, did something armies don't do, which is these combat troops were stationary for a period of almost 4 months because Market Garden had failed. Aachen turned into a house-to-house slugfest. And at this stage, General Eisenhower clearly, wisely thought, let's wait out winter, resupply our lines, get fresh troops, start with a spring offensive. And there they are, tens of thousands of troops getting to know the people in the Netherlands. And that laid the groundwork for what would happen later in the fall, which we'll get to.
Let's come back to Emily for a moment. You know, in a conversation with one of my colleagues about this, I was describing her, and they said, oh, well, kind of like the mother of Normandy. You know, for those that don't know, Madame Simone Renaud, the wife of the mayor of Saint-Mère-Église, became known as the mother of Normandy, and she tended American graves at the cemetery. She wrote back to families. But Margratten's different. And how is it different, and how did that come about?
Well, Madame Renaud is a heroic figure, and no amount of praise, I think, is too great for her. And happily, one of my teachers in my recent years in World War II history, Dr. Nick Mueller, took me aside years ago when I told him I was interested in the subject and said, you need to find out about Madame Renaud. Well, I always listen to what he says. And I went off and I was very interested to know about her. So the big differences come from this. She's the wife of the mayor in Saint-Mère-Église, and she's there watching 101st and 82nd paratroopers drop from the sky in her house, in the town, et cetera, et cetera. And she knew so many of these boys, very similar to what I described happened in the Netherlands. At one point in time, there were 4 temporary cemeteries in Saint-Mère-Église. The cemeteries are a function of where combat deaths are going to occur. So we talk about this, and you can say, well, it sounds morbid. An army needs fuel. An army needs soldiers. It needs ammunition. It needs a place to bury the dead. That's not well, suppose somebody gets killed. It's when they get killed, what are we going to do? And this is a job that befalls grave registration officers. Quartermaster troops oftentimes are the ones digging the graves, but it's a function of war. So wherever there are large casualties, take Market Garden, there's temporary cemeteries in Son and Molenhoek, because we had a lot of 82nd, 101st Airborne casualties there. The same thing happened in Saint-Mère-Église. There were 4 separate smaller cemeteries there. And then at the end of the war, we had something like 110 temporary cemeteries. So if you think of it like this, set aside the morbidity for a moment, it's kind of like, as the government, you're in charge of building hotels. Well, how many hotels do we need? Hotels being a cemetery. Well, I don't know. It depends on how many guests we're going to have. Well, we don't know how many guests we're going to have till families in the United States make an election about, do you want to have your boy brought home at government expense, or do you want to leave them overseas? We're not promising you which cemetery they'll be buried in, because we don't know how many we're going to have. But we need to know basically what's the total denominator before we can start apportioning and determining how many cemeteries there will be. General Eisenhower was convinced there would only be 2 World War II cemeteries in Europe after World War II. He believed that because in World War I, 61% of the families opted to have their boys sent home, 39% stayed in Europe. And he was convinced that would be even a greater number in World War II. As it turned out, the percentages were almost exactly the same. Margraten was a higher number for reasons we'll talk about. So at that point in time, once they had the elections, the government decided, well, we're going to have 14 separate World War II cemeteries from Tunisia and those in Europe. And there was only one in the Netherlands, so they start consolidations. The other two in Netherlands, in Son and Molenhoek, are closed. Those boys are brought to Margraten. And this consolidation's happened. So Madame Renaud is pleading, leave one of them in Saint-Mère-Église. But for obvious reasons, understandable reasons, the grave registration units and powers that be wanted to make sure that there was proper respect given to what took place at Normandy. And that was the bell cow, if you will, of our overseas cemeteries, especially with that majestic setting along the coastline. And it has more boys buried there deliberately, and they closed these other cemeteries along the Normandy coast. We could speculate that had they left one of them there, she would have had one of the key elements to have the kinds of success that took place in Margraten. That isn't the only reason Margraten was successful, but you have something helping you there that you can't manufacture, which is a cemetery with some of the fallen in it. And that was something that she did not have. But for her entire life, till the day she died, she corresponded with these families. She hosted them when they came overseas. I mean, she was a remarkable woman, and it's a real pity that times were as they were, and Emily and Simone didn't have a chance to meet because they were cut from the same cloth.
Absolutely. Along the lines of the consolidations, at its height, I think Margraten had roughly 18,000.
17,800 boys and some women.
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, while there are 10,000 there today, roughly 8,300 buried, 1,722 names on the walls. The missing, all men except for 4 women, 6 Medal of Honor recipients, 6 members of Band of Brothers. There are a number of Bedford boys there, 172 Black Americans, 115 boys from the state of Louisiana, 55 twins, none buried there with their twin brother, 40 sets of brothers buried side by side. So a total of 10,000 overall, all of whom have adopters today. At the point in time you're talking about, after the consolidations at the cemetery in May 45 and in the months that followed, the number swelled to 17,800, and all of those boys had adopters. There were 8,000 that were brought back after the war, roughly leaving 10,000 there today. All 8,000 of those, for the 4 years that they were there till they were brought back to the States, they all had adopters too. So there's 8,000 boys buried in this country now who had Dutch adopters for 4 years.
So there are 10,000 Americans there and 10,000 different stories. Now, of course, I would say it's a no-brainer that one of the people that you feature in Remember Me is Walter Hutchhausen, who was one of the monuments men. And we're going to talk a little more about him in a bit, but of the 12, how did you select those out of the 10,000? And I mean, it's kind of maybe the wrong word to use, but do you have favorites? Is there some that you just can't get out of your mind?
Well, certainly the 12 I wrote about, but dozens and dozens that we just couldn't include in the book. Seth Givens, Dr. Seth Givens, who is one of my closest friends, who is a senior military historian for the Marine Corps by day and is a remarkable contribution to history and teacher. We spent years going through, they call them IDPFs, individual deceased personnel files. Some are thin, some are very thick, jacket covers, but it have induction papers, notification about deaths and things like that. But they sometimes have a lot of family correspondence in them. So, you know, Hollywood's always talking about, you know, we love to tell hero stories. We have 17,800 to choose from. The problem then is, how do you distill this down to convey a narrative arc and tell a story? Because that's what I am. I tell stories. I learned from Nick Mueller because I didn't have a chance to meet Stephen Ambrose. And we know from Ken Burns and David McCullough and everybody else, tell stories. You want to educate? Tell stories. Don't mention the E word. Just tell great stories. People love telling stories, retelling stories. It's why jokes work. People love to be the star of the stage, to be able to tell it. And we picked these 12, I picked these 12 for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which was I wanted to remind everybody, without ever saying it, we're a country of immigrants. We were, we are, we always will be. And that was a good thing. We set aside our differences to unite and figure out how everybody did what they could do. Some people had more capacity and did more. This is why the Dutch grave adoption program worked. What the wife of a mayor could do, who was 37 years old, Emily, was different than what a young girl, 19 years old, named Frida could do. But they each did what they were able to do, and that made a massive difference. So I picked a guy that's straight out of Central Casting, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, who was a soldier, born on Fort Sam Houston. His father was an officer also, and he had actually had trained with Lieutenant Colonel Dwight Eisenhower at Fort Lewis. And Eisenhower loved him. He was the hard-charging kind of guy that he liked. The only detriment or challenge for Cole getting into airborne was that they were looking for guys that weren't married who might not know better than to volunteer to be a paratrooper. But he was such a great soldier, they wanted him, and he ultimately would be decorated with the Medal of Honor for his heroism at Carrington, where he should have been killed several times, but he wasn't. I wanted to tell the story of these two twins, the Norton brothers, James and Edward Norton, who in the infinite wisdom of the Army Air Corps decided there was nothing wrong with a pilot and a co-pilot being twin brothers. So they were pilots of the Widowmaker, the Marauder. I wanted to make sure that we had a story about a chaplain. We don't read much about that, but this is a remarkable guy, Pat Folks, who was from McLean, Virginia. Now to tie this to the previous discussion with Alex, he was such a great orator that Justice Jackson would drive from Washington out to McLean to hear him speak on Sundays. He wanted to volunteer. The Army at the outbreak of the war was woefully behind on clergy, and he would never have been drafted, but he volunteered. He was 27, and he had a son already, and he would have a daughter while he's overseas. He was in air transport, so he would say goodbye to the guys that were paratroopers and feel like, well, he wasn't doing his job because he wasn't there with them when they were going through the worst of it. And he got asked for a transfer, and he was approved, 17th Airborne. And so he made his first jump during varsity because he wanted to be right there with the boys. That's a great story of this guy that just kept going out of his way to get closer and closer to the danger because he felt that was what he needed to do. And then, of course, because we involve a cemetery, we needed someone that knew something about what was it like burying these guys. And I know we'll talk about that, but that's why I chose Jeff Wiggins, who was from Dothan, Alabama, and was a part of the 960th Quartermaster Troop, and he and his fellow quartermaster troops were tasked with this difficult task.
Well, let's get into that then. Let's talk a little bit about the process. One of the things that amazed me is you gave an example of a soldier who died on the front line in the morning, and by the time the sun went down that day, he had been recovered, transported, processed, and buried in one day. How did that work?
Well, it didn't always work out that way. Some did, some didn't. And of course, if they're in more of a larger battle, then oftentimes the casualties exceeded the pace at which they could bury them. And so there are all sorts of reports written in the field about guys arriving, people showing up at the cemetery and seeing bodies packed up, as they refer to it, like cordwood. And you have to consider the cemetery construction starts in September. They figure it'll take a couple of weeks. It takes almost 2 months because it keeps raining. And this soil there has a heavy clay component. So you put a 5-pound shovel in and it comes out at 10 pounds because so much stuff's stuck to it. These guys were lucky sometimes to complete one grave in a day. They're working in, the temperature's dropping like crazy. Sometimes it's sleeting. You know, doesn't sound that bad because we have different kind of material for clothes today, but think about when you jump in the swimming pool wearing a t-shirt and you get out and it's stuck to you, and then add 3 or 4 pounds of clothes on top of you because you're just trying to get layers, but none of it's protecting them from this, and then it gets stiff from how cold it is. The bodies arrive on trucks, bodies and body parts. The black gravediggers are there to lift the bodies out of the truck and line them up. There's no wood at the cemetery. There's not a single coffin. Everybody's buried in bed sheets. The bodies come, and there's a series of tents called the stripping line, where the grave registration officers are working with these really inconvenient gloves. And they have to do that because otherwise they can get blood poisoning, which will kill them. Very serious. It's a dangerous job because a lot of these soldiers have ammunition, live ammunition on them. Sometimes they come in and their body's frozen and they have a hand grenade in their hand with a pin pulled. So they have to go through and make sure all of this is taken out of the way. Then the soldiers brought in, all the personal objects are removed, make sure that identification's the key focus of everybody. They take the dog tags, they place one in the mouth if there's a head. The other one's nailed to the cross because they don't have time to be stenciling names on. So you can generally tell the time of when a photograph's taken about how muddy it is, whether the graves have been mounded yet, if there's a dog tag on the cross or Star of David, or if the name's stenciled. They bring the boys out, and 4 women in this case, so there were more women at the time. They lay them down on the bed sheets. There's crosses laying there that don't have the dog tag on them yet. And then it takes 2 or 3 guys to lift the body up and be able to slip the sack up over them or over the body parts. And then place it on a stretcher, carry them out, get down in the ground where the grave's dug, bury it. There are grave registration officers overseeing all of this, supervising it. There's some sort of service for everyone that's been buried each day. So, you know, you figure you can suck it up and deal with about anything for a day or 2. But what I always was overwhelmed with concerning this task was the monotony of it. When are we not going to have to dig graves, sir? Well, when's the killing going to end? And nobody knew. Day after day, week after week, for the 3136th quartermaster troops that were there before and months after Jeff Wiggins' group was there, it would go on for 7 months. Every day, showing up. They got to shower once a week, sometimes twice, not often. The people in town, 9/10 of a mile away, when the wind's blowing, they knew what was going on out there right away. The trucks drive through the town of Margraten. There's a registrar stand where the drivers get out and get coffee, and then they log in how many bodies they think they've got, provide a name, then they get authorization to go out to the cemetery. There was a period of time in March 1945 after varsity starts that the quartermaster troops couldn't keep up with all the bodies being brought in. And the local people in Margraten, the mayor there said, don't worry, to Joseph Showman, the head of the grave registration unit, don't worry, we've got you covered. And he told all the people there, go to your barn, get your shovel, walk out to the cemetery. And they stood shoulder to shoulder with the quartermaster troops and helped dig graves. So it's an amazing story because it is intertwined with the people that live there. And I'll mention this when we talk about the grave adoption program, but it's Dutch soil that's been loaned in perpetuity to the United States. The cemetery is run by our American Battle Monuments Commission, who manages all of our cemeteries. But those boys out there, they're their boys. Everybody that's adopted one of these soldiers out there refers to him as my soldier. And they're in oftentimes the second and third, and now beginning the fourth generation of family members that have taken care of these boys for 81 years, just like they said they were going to. Think about any promises you all can have a personal experience with that have lasted 81 years. Half the marriages end up with, I do, I don't. People promise you, well, I'll call you for lunch. They don't, and you're not surprised that they don't. 81 years.
You know, if you go to Margraten today, or Sannavold, or Meuse-Argonne, or Normandy Cemetery, they're absolutely gorgeous. They're laid out in perfect rows. As a matter of fact, they were intentionally designed with the phrase e pluribus unum in mind. They're very American, and they're gorgeous. But that winter that you're talking about, it wasn't. You know, it's not far from Bastogne. It's not far from the breakthrough in the Battle of the Bulge. So, and everybody's heard about the kind of winter that was. What was that cemetery like at that time? Because we're all picturing this beautiful place, and it wasn't.
You go there today, and I mentioned 8,300 gravestones, Stars of David, and Latin crosses on 65.5 acres. That same 65.5 acres in May 1945 had 21,000 bodies buried there. There were 3,000 Germans in a separate area of the cemetery. There were about 1,000 non-American Allied soldiers that were buried there, and then 18,000 or so Americans on the same amount of space. I mean, they buried them as closely together as they could. Clumps of mud, crosses, despite an effort to get them in the ground and have them stable, crooked. For those of you that are curious, they will never ever be crooked anywhere because there are concrete foundations with rebar in them poured when everybody's removed from all of the cemeteries, any of our cemeteries overseas, with posts protruding that the crosses sit on. And that's why you will never see one bent, leaning, or otherwise. It was a horrific sight that they tried to clean up as much as they could for the first Memorial Day in May 1945 by mounding the graves, so creating about a 1.5 foot riser in a rectangular area with some flowers on it. But again, you can always identify the date of the photograph because there's not a lick of blade of grass or flower. I mean, the flowers that are there are a bouquet that's been placed there. What was there in May 1945 were 40,000 Dutch people to say goodbye to so many of these boys that they knew. The towns around there have 200, 300. Margraten's got 1,200, then, today, probably forever. 40,000 people, no cars, no gas. They walked, they rode their bikes, they took horses and carts, but they were there. The New York Times said it was without precedent for foreigners to venerate Americans in such a way.
There's, you know, we talked a little bit about the 12 characters that you selected, but there's, one of the things that truly impressed me about the book was that there seems to be a 13th character, and that character's grief. It's not all focused on just the 12 men or women that you selected to talk about. Some of it is about the grief that the families had to deal with, or even the Dutch families had to deal with. And, you know, in some, you know, they either dealt with it or they didn't. I'm thinking of Moore or the Norton brothers. There's somewhere it shortened the life of some of the parents. You know, do you think that shared grief between the Dutch and the American families in there? You talk a lot about the mothers. Do you think that has to do with why Emily connected so well and made her so successful? When you talk about her tour here in the States, there was something that made her connect with people. And do you think that's that 13th character?
I think there's, we could say 13th and 14th. Khalil Gibran, the great poet and philosopher, said, if you want to know great happiness, then you have to make peace with knowing great sorrow, because they're the opposite ends of the same bed. You are right. Grief is omnipresent in the story. But the other end of the bed is gratitude, remembrance, and grace. And you can't appreciate the magnitude, this high watermark, in my judgment, of civilization, of the expression of that, now for 81 years, if you don't understand the depth of the grief that everybody was experiencing. The Dutch that knew a lot of these boys that felt like they'd lost a member of their family, and of course the American families. What ends up happening is this. In the cemetery receives the first body in November, the first one that's buried in November, 1944. And there are casualties, of course, but there's other armies have other cemeteries, so Margratten's not filling up with them at that stage. They're not behind the 8 ball. There are bodies to be buried, but they know with the spring offensive coming, get ready. And there's one civilian, a Dutch fellow, who's wearing a business suit, who's allowed out there on government grounds. And an officer from South Carolina, Captain Lane, walks over to him and says, what are you doing? Who are you? And he said, well, I'm out here, authorization of the Margratten mayor, because I'm fluent in English and we thought it'd be helpful to you all. And he said, well, in fact, it is. My cousin from South Carolina, Captain Lane, is buried here. And I was wanting to know, I've gotten orders to move out. Would you watch over his grave? And Joseph Van Laar said, well, it would be a great honor to do so. In fact, I will adopt him. He didn't mean it literally, it was just figurative. And some other soldiers were there looking at graves of their buddies, and they too had orders to move out. They went over and saw these two guys talking and asked Van Laar, who are you? What were you talking to the officer about? And he explained it, and they said, well, would you do that for our friends? Because we've got to go too. And he said, absolutely. And so in January 1945, after it's clear we've turned the tide of Battle of the Bulge, because the people in this area of the Netherlands, they're not too far. I mean, within 50-mile radius of this area of Margratten, we don't think of Tom Brokaw said this in the 75th anniversary of World War II. He said kind of the one undertold story about war is in the Netherlands. And so we tell it more in the context of battles. Well, consider this. Within 50 miles of where we're talking about, you have Market Garden, the Battle of Aachen, Hurtgen Forest, and Battle of the Bulge. pretty big spot, and a lot of casualties. And when Battle of the Bulge starts, the people in Margratten, Maastricht, in this area are thinking, are you kidding me? Like, we were occupied for 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days. Then the Americans descend from the heavens and rescue us, and now the Germans are pushing them back. Are we going to be doing this again? Well, it turned out that they didn't. And the townspeople got together at the end of January 45. We have 4 more months of fighting going on, and the spring offensive yet to be fought. And the mayor of Margratten, a guy named Ronkers, and the 7 or 8 towns council people in this little town got together to ask this question: how do we thank our liberators if they're not alive to thank? And they go around the room and they have ideas of special masses and parades and things like that. And then Van Laar speaks up. He says, I have an idea. I've been promising all these soldiers out there at the cemetery that I'll watch over the graves of their buddies, and I've promised so many people I can't possibly do it myself. Maybe we could create some sort of program like that. Well, Ronkers knew a good idea when he heard it. And that's how it started. He assigned it to a parish priest who was 32 years old and was a good guy, but didn't have the horsepower to dedicate himself to this. So he's putting the word out here and there, and by the first Memorial Day, they have a couple hundred adopters. And then in the latter part of in the late summer 45, the mail service resumes between the United States and the Netherlands. United States and Europe. And Emily Michels Van Kestik, who is the wife of the mayor of Maastricht, the capital city of Limburg, that's 10 miles from the cemetery going the other direction, west, and has about 50,000 residents. Her husband, the mayor, along with Ronkers and Margraten and all the mayors in this region, start getting letters from families in the United States, entrepreneurial families, wives, moms, dads, who have gotten the worst news possible. And they're looking on maps, and they can't find Margraten, but they know it's in the south of the Netherlands, and so they're starting to write mayors, just letters. And a letter arrives, a specific letter arrives at Town Hall in Maastricht that goes something like this. My name's Maybelle File. I'm from Demopolis, Alabama. My husband was killed on his 25th birthday 4 months ago. He was my everything. I would be beholding to you all the days of my life, seeing that your town's near the cemetery. If you could take a photo of his grave and send it to me. Think about COVID. The one thing that we saw over and over in the paper were people saying, I didn't get a chance to say goodbye. They wanted something to grieve over. And there was nothing that Americans could do to go there or to have anything sent to them, and the War Department wasn't in the business of two-way communications with touchy-feely letters. The mayor handed this letter to his wife, Emily Michels Van Kestik, a dynamo, who had been helping General Corlett and the other Ninth General Simpson. They were very friendly with them, helping organize dances for the frontline troops to try and give them some R&R. And she was, in a way, disappointed about the withdrawal of troops because she said poignantly, and I put it in the book, that her work doing that was the first time anybody had ever seen her as something other than Mrs. Mayor. And she had a sense of purpose and identity, and she was looking for a place to take that energy. And when she got this letter, she went out to the cemetery and took her two of her daughters and took a photograph. She mailed it to this lady in Demopolis, Alabama. Well, this lady, 26 years old, wow, what a woman. She copies the letter and copies a photograph and writes a letter to the editor to Life magazine and says, you know, there's this wonderful lady in Maastricht who did XYZ for me, and I know there's a lot of other widows and a lot of other moms out there that are hurting like I am, and she's such a nice lady, and I'm just sure if you wrote her, she'd be happy to help you too. And 3,000 letters show up in no time flat. And when the letters arrive, expressing as much as a human being can convey with words the sorrow in the homes and the transformation of lives that's going to happen as a consequence. Emily realizes that it's all well and good that we have this idea of adopting the graves of dead boys. But there's a higher calling. We need to cross the ocean and reach into the American homes and try and assuage the grief, especially where we knew these boys, where we spent time with them. We have photographs with them. We have letters that they've written home that they didn't address, that we want to get to the families. And that's when the program really transformed. Well, they tried to get the names and addresses of the next of kin from the American Grave Registration Unit, and they refused to provide it. So Emily, being the dynamo that she was, decided, I'll write a letter to the Chief Executive Officer of the United States of America. And she writes a letter to President Truman. I carry it around with me. And here's the grave adoption program in her words, she doesn't refer to it that way, summed up in a sentence. And she says, after apologizing for the impudence of a commenter writing the president, and now that most of the Army has gone back to the States and only your fallen heroes remain in our soil, we want to establish a lasting tie between their relatives and our people. That's it. That's the whole idea. Beautiful letter. Fantastic. President Truman sends it over to the Army quartermaster. He writes a letter back 4 months later saying, sorry, we can't help you. So Emily's fit to be tied. She exchanges letters with Maybelle Field, the widow that she wrote, who they commonly commiserate. And finally, after the second Memorial Day, in June 1946, she decides the only way we're going to get these names is I need to go over there and hand gather them and try and raise visibility of what we're doing. So she gets on an airplane, the very first plane she's ever flown on. She flies from Amsterdam to LaGuardia Field. She spends 3 days in New York City. Then she goes to Washington. This part of her trip's planned. She meets different members of Congress, including a young guy from the great state of Texas named Lyndon Johnson, who sees in her the same sense of drive and determination that he had. And he tells her, young lady, if you want to meet people that are connected to soldiers' families, go to Texas. There's a lot of bases down there. And she flies, who can make this up, to Dallas, Texas, where I'm from. There's 2 families there to greet her at Love Field. One of them's lived 3 blocks from where I live. They fought over her. One was supposed to be there. The other one just knew she was coming and went there. So she had to divide her time between the 2. And that set off 5 weeks of her traveling around to Mineral Wells, Lockhart, Fort Worth, all the way across the southeast, including stopping in Demopolis to meet Melville File, over to Atlanta, up the eastern seaboard, every night in a different home of someone she did not know, someone that had lost a boy during the war. Sometimes these boys that had been killed weren't even killed in the Netherlands, but she was somebody to talk to, someone that would listen. She spoke at American Legion conferences. She did radio programs. By the latter part of her trip, there was kind of a Taylor Swift effect. There's telegrams arriving saying, I'm on a bus in Minneapolis. It's going to take me 20 hours to get to you, but I have to see you. Because it was all anybody had for someone to speak to. And with everyone she talked to, she told these families, and especially the young widows who were getting pretty close to the age of her oldest daughter, it's going to be 3 or 4 years before your son or daughter will come back if you elect that. Move on with your lives. Leave your boys with us. We'll watch over them like our own forever. A forever promise. And here today, 81 years later, they have continuously done exactly that.
Wow. Well, I know we want to get to Q&A, but I will take one last prerogative. I could keep going, but there's one last one, and quite frankly, because I love it so much. I'd like to turn to the so what part of this story. You've often cited a wonderful poem by Archibald MacLeish, where he makes the point that the fallen can't give meaning to their own sacrifice. It's not for them to say. What does he say in that poem, and is that the challenge to us? Is that really the meaning of this?
I think there are 2 meanings, but let's talk about Archibald. And I won't need any of my words because I'll just give you his. The poem is titled, "The Young Dead Soldiers Do Not Speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks to us at night and when the clock counts. They say, we were young, we have died. Remember us. They say we have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done. They say we have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave. They say our deaths are not ours, they are yours. They will mean what you make them. They say whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say that. They say we leave you our deaths. Give them their meaning. Give them an end to the war and a true peace. Give them a victory that ends the war. Give them their meaning. We were young, they say. We have died. Remember us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Edsel. So Jeremy, I know we've got a bunch of questions, so let's go ahead and get started there.
Yeah, and Robert, thank you so much. And the audience, you know me, I like questions, not comments, but I'm going to take floor MC's prerogative and ask that one or two of the first microphone holders make a comment, because as I mentioned earlier, we have some of our guides who lead our tours overseas, and I know that they have some special connections. We're going to start with Edvin.
Oh God. What can I say? Clarence Fainert from Bear County, San Antonio, Texas, 4th Bomber Mission, door gunner or waist gunner, 23rd of March 1944. He's one of 5 graves I adopted in 4 different cemeteries.
So we have a debt of honor. That's how I always see it. And these guys came over to liberate us. Not all came home. And it's something that we need to look after forever. It's one of the reasons why we adopt these graves. I'm very fortunate to adopt 2 American soldiers, one at Mark Rath and one at Henri Chapelle. Richard Walsh, Steuben County, Indiana, killed on January 4th, 1945, during the Battle of the Bulge. And Richard Bonner, who was with the 101st Airborne Division, killed near Bastogne. And I'm just now talking to Stephen, who has found the IDPF files for me, just now, just 10 minutes before this one. So, well, thank you.
Jeremy, let me make a comment first. I hope both you guys will come see me afterwards because I'd like to visit with you briefly. These men and women that are there, they weren't left behind. They are our eyes and ears to history. They are the sentinels of democracy. They are there to remind us the immense horrors of war and the sorrow that comes with it. But they're also there, I think, to underscore the importance of our relationships, of preserving our relationships with these allies of ours and other nations of goodwill. So for all these reasons and the passions and fidelity which both of you fellows have demonstrated, you know, I get a lot of very kind remarks about Monuments Men and Remember Us and the other things that we've done, and you know, my partnership with Brett Witter on writing those 2 books. And people refer to me as an author, and I'm really not. I really, really am not. I mean, I love doing the research and the writing, but I'm a messenger. I admire Rick Atkinson and Don Miller and Nick and so many others, because if it was 8 years of my life to write a book, I'd rather gnaw off my writing hand. But if there's a message, if there's a purpose, if there's a cause, I'm all in. I spent 15 years researching Monuments Men and the books related to that. And that work continues to this day through the good works of the foundation, and the museum's been a beneficiary of that work, to its great credit, with the Monuments Men and Women Gallery here. But I was pretty much done. I mean, I have a 2-year-old and, a second grader and a third grader, 7 and 9, at home watching. Hi, boys. Listen to your mom. And it's painful at 68 years old to not be with them all the time. And it's painful, the solitude that you have to spend, and I spent 8 years. When I got involved in this, Anna was pregnant with our first child. That's how far this goes back for me. But I didn't get into this because Walter Hutchhausen, the one American monuments officer killed during war, happens to be buried there. I knew, and I mentioned this at the end of Monuments Men, that there was a 19-year-old girl named Frida Van Skyke who lived in a town 5 miles from the cemetery, who wrote Harvard in October 45, asking if Harvard could provide the name and address of his mother because she wanted to let her know that she walked 5 miles to and 5 miles from the cemetery several times a week to place fresh flowers on his grave. And Harvard, like many of the Ivy League schools, had war registrars that received a lot of inquiries like this, and they responded within a matter of few weeks. Frida then became a pen pal with the Hutchhausens, and I knew that and wanted to include that as a coda to the story about Hutchhausen. And I thought I was done. And you all that know about my work on Monuments Men know I wasn't looking, when I sold my business and moved to Europe, I was looking for meaningfulness. I didn't know where that was going to take me. I just carved out the time for fate to tap me on the shoulder. And it did when I was crossing the Ponte Vecchio one day and wondered, well, if Europe was so beat up by the war, how'd all these works of art survive and who are the people that saved them? And it was the absence of the internet and Google and everything that lured me in because there was no easy answer. And then I realized, well, I don't think anybody's really told that story. I'll tell you what, that's what I'm going to do. And when I met Lane Faison, one of the Monuments Men, who told me, you know, I've been waiting to meet you all my life, 10 days before he died, I knew that's what I was supposed to do. And I thought I was done. But in 2015, when we organized the Congressional Gold Medal ceremony at Congress at the request of Speaker of the House Boehner, who wanted us to do it because we knew all the family members, we contacted, and we had 200 family members there for that august ceremony. And one of the people that responded was the nephew of Walter Hutchhausen, Jim Hutchhausen, who's still alive, a fantastic fellow in California. And he wrote me to say, by the way, I just got back from England. I had a wonderful visit with Frida. And here's a photo. And I thought, Frida, Frida, Frida. I don't know any Fridas. And there was this woman with this crown of white hair. And he thinks I know something. The only Frida I know of was that 19-year-old, oh my God, she's still alive. So I started a pen pal relationship with her. She married a British soldier after the war, which is why she was in England. And Anna and I went to England, and we met with her by coincidence. We woke up one day and thought, geez, it's Memorial Day. It was Memorial Day 2016. She was 5 months pregnant with our first son. And Anna said to me, do you have ambitions for going to see her? And I said, ambitions, like what? And she said, well, like writing another book. And I said, no. Are you crazy? No. I don't even know what a book would be about. I mean, she was the last person to see Hutchhausen before he was killed. I feel duty bound to go talk to her. So I went there, and she was expecting me, bear hugged me. She had all these photo albums on her table. Said, you know, you want to see the photos when the American tanks are driving past our house on September 13th? Yeah. I love photos. Said, you seem to know a lot about this. And I said, well, I know something. I said, you know, I'm familiar with the area. Have you ever been to the American Military Cemetery? And I said, you mean Netherlands American Cemetery? Well, we always knew it as American Military Cemetery. Yes, I've been. Are you sure? Yes, I'm very sure I've been. So you know about the grave adoption program? And I said, the what? And she said, the grave adoption program. And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And she started describing it to me, and I said, so, well, did you do that? And she said, yeah, I was the adopter of Hutchhausen. And I left there and came back, and I said, I need to go do some research. And then I went back over there a few months later, and I said, okay, now I know something about what you're talking about. Tell me all over again. Tell me everything you told me. And I realized we don't know this story. And we need to know this story. So the mission here was to write the book. But the bigger picture, and the reason I wrote the book and spent 8 years of my life, now 9, was we entered into the Monuments Men and Women Foundation, which exists to preserve our shared cultural heritage. This grave adoption program at Cemetery is a UNESCO designated intangible cultural heritage, preservation of a custom that is unique. We didn't need to have that, but it's a nice thing to be involved with the UNESCO-related project. So we entered into a joint venture with the Dutch Foundation for Adopting Graves that has managed these 10,000 Dutch adopters for 81 years. And we called it the Forever Promise Project. The 10,000 Dutch adopters are in contact with only 2,000 of the American families. Emily did a great job, but there's 8,000 American families that have no idea there's a grave adoption program over there. They have no idea there's someone in the Netherlands that has taken care of the grave of their loved one for 81 years, or families, successor families. They have no idea that there's some families in the Netherlands that have photographs of their boys or letters that weren't sent or didn't have an address to send home. So we created a searchable database, foreverpromise.org. We didn't put it on the foundation website because we have so much content, we figured it would blow up our website. Foreverpromise.org. We have a searchable database of all 10,000 men and 4 women that are buried there. We're asking people to go there and see, do you have a relative that's buried there? If you do, a short questionnaire pops up, real short. What's your relationship to the person? Are you aware there's a grave adoption program? Are you in contact with your adopter? If you're not, would you like to be? Will you give us permission to share your contact information with our colleagues in the Netherlands? We have in 3 months, and we're just getting started, connected 400 American families with their Dutch adopters. It's just a game, it's a visibility, that's all it is. We're not going to go and try and find everybody. We're going to get people to find them for us and have them find us. And it's something that we can do and we should do. And it raises an even bigger question, and we are, as a foundation, working on this too. Why in the world do we not have a grave adoption program in the United States for our men and women in uniform taken care of by Americans, in particular younger people? And that's what we're working on now.
Connie has a question to the left, towards the back, please.
Robert, just thank you so much for, and I always express the opinions of everyone here, just the deepest gratitude for you bringing this so important and touching a project that you're going through. Following up, for those of us that may have an interest in going to Margarten, and what would be the best way to get there? And also, when we get there, is there a way to interact with some of the local people to further express our appreciation for the just really wonderful work they're doing?
If you come see me afterwards, I'll give you a card, or I'll give it to anybody that's here, or make sure you know how to reach me. And anyone that wants to go, we'll get you an address, you write us, and we will make sure that the people that run the grave adoption program over there, my colleagues Franz Robruck and Ton Hermes, both of whom are adopters. Franz Robruck's mom and dad adopted they were friends with an American soldier that lived in their home from November until he went into Germany in March, and he didn't come back alive. And they were the first adopters of him, and it has stayed in the family now. They're on generation 3. So we'll get you a contact number, so if people want to go, you can contact them, and they'll have an adopter come out there and walk you around the cemetery and stay with you as long as you want to be with them, because that's how we're going. I've had people tell me, your vision's impossible, you'll never get this done, especially when I talk about a domestic grave adoption program. I don't like hearing that. No one likes getting told no or things are impossible, but it's fractional compared to what people told me when I had the idea of the Monuments Men. I mean, they were ready to cart me off to the loony bin then. And towards the end, I was about ready to volunteer. But we're not wrong. Are you telling me that in a country of 335 million people, 30 times the size of the Netherlands, we can't find enough people to adopt our own soldiers? I don't believe it. I don't believe it for a second. It just takes energy, it takes willpower, it takes vision, it takes stick-to-itiveness. But this is doable, and it's the right thing to do. And we have 17 veteran suicides a day. While we've been sitting here, somebody's shot themselves or killed themselves some other way, some veteran has. And this isn't the solution to it. There isn't a single thing that's a solution. But we've all seen these World War II movies, Vietnam movies. We never leave anyone on the field of battle. The right thing to do, not to leave them. But I don't really see the glory in whether we leave them over there and forget about them, or we bring them back over here and forget about them. It isn't where their body is. It's remembering them. And that is an opportunity for us to do what they've done in Margraten. They have turned that cemetery into a classroom. And you know who the teachers are? The 10,000 men and 4 women that are buried there. They take their kids out there and stand them in front of the graves, whole classes, whole schools. Some of the schools are adopters themselves. And they tell them the things that they're thinking, the words they use to express their ideas and thoughts are the definition of freedom they have that these boys and girls who are not much older than they are, who were not much older than they are, had and gave up so that they could do it. That's it. Unfortunately, my boys are going to go up in the world. They're not going to be any World War II veterans. There aren't anybody, no one is around anymore that lived through the hardships of the Depression and knew what real hardship was like. We don't teach it in schools anymore. When we deal with public schools, we hear about, they have a day in March that they teach, that they talk about this. And I always ask them the whole day, and they say, well, no, that's to talk about Western European history. Well, how much of that's World War II? Well, I don't know, hour. So I had a journalist a few weeks ago say to me, are you saying that we as a country are kind of drifting away from our roots here and understanding all this, losing what Tom Brokaw refers to, rightly so, as the connective tissue between our military and citizens? And I said, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. We're not drifting, we're in full sprint. And if that alarms you, if that is a problem for you, help us find a solution. And the only solution I know, but I'll get behind anybody else's, is let's bring life back to our veterans that are buried in this country and engage and challenge our young people to take a field trip, not involving this thing, but involving your feet, and go out and find a soldier, adopt that soldier, and get them engaged in a program. The Dutch have handed us the template, and they did it for 10,000 soldiers of ours. We can do this. So anyway, that's what we're working on.
Actually, if I may, Jeremy, real quickly, this is because you teed it up perfectly. The discussion about education, and I often say that any museum worth its salt is at first an educational institution. And I'm very proud of the fact that the strategic plan that this museum announced last summer is mainly focused on education. And our teams are doing fantastic work, not only in higher education, lifelong learning, but really a focus on kindergarten through 12th grade education. We have completely redone how we do field trips to make them more meaningful, more impactful for these students. And we're going to be doing a lot more of that. And not only for students here, but reaching out across the country. Sending out what I call mobile training teams, but sending out master educators around the country to work with teachers around the country, and then also an online presence. And I'm proud to be part of an organization that takes that part of our mission so seriously, and that's one of the things that this museum does. We should be very proud of that.
It does very well.
Next question's all the way in the back, standing next to me.
Hi, thank you. Fabulous talk. You mentioned at one point that there were 4,000 German soldiers buried in that cemetery. Are they still there, and who takes care of them?
Good question. No, I said 3,000, and if I said 4, apologies, it was 3,000. So they had them in a separate area, and our quartermaster troops buried those soldiers also. There's a cemetery in a Dutch town named Edsel, which is not too far. It's an hour or so away from where Market Garden, about an hour from where Market Garden and Margraten are. And they have, by coincidence, about 65 acres also. And on their 65 acres, they have 30,000 gravestones of German soldiers. There are some from World War I. Most of them are World War II. It is worth a visit. I drove up there really not knowing what to expect. It's not manicured like our cemeteries. It is taken care of. There are some grave markers that are chipped, some at an angle. It's not there aren't attendants out there every day, but it's organized. And they have a beautiful visitor center. And that was really interesting to me because I thought, boy, talk about an impossible needle to thread. How do you, as Germany, having accepted your responsibility for what took place during World War II, how do you present that message at a cemetery like this? And I'll tell you what, I take my hat off to them. They did a great job. It's a very moving film that they've put together. There's no whitewashing of history. There's no hagiography of any of it. It just presents to you just how horrible war is, and well worth a visit. So if you're there, I'd drive up there and take a look.
It's also, if you're in Normandy and have the time, it is definitely worth, because they're not that far apart. The American cemetery, the British or Canadian cemeteries, because there are a couple of them, and then also the German cemetery. And you will, it's good to see all three of them kind of like on the same day, because they are very distinct and reflective of the cultures of the countries that they represent.
Next question's going to be to your right, gentleman, with Frank.
That was a very inspirational talk and presentation. It moved me to think about an American serviceman who I occasionally remember, but he was slightly obscure. He's buried in Plot A, Row 3, Grave 38 in the American Normandy Cemetery. His name's First Lieutenant Eugene Rosner. And he says his state, Pennsylvania, doesn't show a unit. The reason it doesn't show a unit, it says date of death, 9th of July, 1943, because on that night, just before 2 o'clock in the morning, he was at the controls of a British Lancaster bomber that was shot down that night. I only know about him, partially courtesy of the World War II Museum, because on that night, the night he died, one of his fellow members of 106 Squadron was one of the boys from Aldbourne, which is, of course, the base from which Easy Company were based in the UK. And when you said that poem, I immediately thought of the words of our promise to remember servicemen, which goes something like this. They shall grow not old as we that left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
Thank you, Frank. We're going to stay to the right as soon as the microphone makes its way down the aisle.
Thank you for such a moving.
When we're done.
Thank you for such a moving presentation. It was marvelous.
Thank you for being
Is Emily's family still involved with the graves?
You said Emily?
Yes.
Yes, one of the great joys of my life. Well, before I met my wife, my mom said, "You need to date." And I said, "Well, I do." And she said, No, you need to be around other women. And I said, "Well, I am." She said, No, someone that's not 90 years old. Emily's oldest daughter, Jenicky, is still alive. She's 94. She's one of my dear, dear friends. I knew Frida for 8 years and delivered Frida's eulogy 2 years ago when she died in the summer. Jenicky I was with a couple of weeks ago in the Netherlands. I see her several times a year. She was the third child, the first daughter. The first two children were twin boys. And she has been my such a critical access point to all of this data and information that we had access to. And she was an adopter. She was 13 then. We have photos of her out there at the cemetery. Emily died in 1970. The war killed her. She, like many people in the Netherlands, many people in Europe, she died as the consequence of twisted kidneys and malnutrition during the war that just finally caught up with her and her body couldn't do it. But until the day she died, like Madame Renaud, families that went there would contact her. She would arrange for lunch at her home. She would have already been out to the cemetery to place flowers on the grave and take them out there. So she was a remarkable, remarkable person.
Ladies and gentlemen, Robert Edsel and Pete Crean.
Robert. I think Robert had
So- Oh, please.
Let me just appeal to all of you all before you head off to the men and ladies room, and I will stay here. I'll be here for at least an hour and sign books and all that stuff. If you believe in the mission here, the Forever Promise thing, help us. If you have people that you know of that have genealogical experience, of course, that's great. But we don't need that complicated degree of help. In your communities, if you have neighborhood groups, go to the list and see. You can search it by the city that you live in or the town. If you have someone that you know that had a relative die in service in Europe in World War II, ask them to check our website. If you have friends or relatives that are journalists, local media, national media, put them in touch with us. If you have financial resources, we need help with respect to the magnitude of the challenge that we have here. But there is a way for everybody to get engaged and help. And we would appreciate your help because this is something that we can do, and we are determined to help 81 years later finish what the Dutch started and make that the one place in the world that every grave adopter is in contact with the relative of the American that they take care of. And I thank you in advance for your help.
Thank you, Robert. I'd also like to thank our friend Shelby. I'd like to thank Anna. I'd like to thank our friend Seth Givens, who works with Robert on his research. Sorry they couldn't be here with us. Robert invited you all to come see him, but I'm going to invite you to go see him at the book signing table so we can clear the stage. We have about 30 minutes, but we need to get you back here at 3:45 for the final session of the day. And a last reminder that tonight's special dinner and screening, we have a few, I think only 10 seats available left for Frog Fathers 2 Okinawa. That's $115 a person, and they must be purchased at the travel desk. And at the travel desk, you can learn about our tours where you can visit some of these grave sites. Thank you very much, and we'll see you back at 3:45.